Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice of you to join me at this hour when, when I was a student in university, I wished that this was true, that you could come at this hour, have a drink, sit down, don't need to take notes, don't have any examination, no degrees. This is the way education should be. And those of us, those few of us that went to the show, ashore today. Did anybody go to that show? I think everybody did, yes. Well, as my sister Mimi says, aren't we lucky we're not allergic to feathers? And I have to say, I'm somewhat embarrassed that I'm going to talk about Amazonian native culture after what we saw today. But it reminds me of the old story. It's an American Western story about the Lone Ranger and Tonto. And of course, Tonto in Spanish means the fool, and he would call the Lone Ranger Kimosabe, which is short for the one that does not know. I mean, just for your cultural background. And so the story is that the Lone Ranger and Tonto are surrounded by Apaches or Comanches, and they're outnumbered, and the Lone Ranger says to Tonto, "We're surrounded." And Tonto says, "What do you mean, we, Kimosabe?" Now, I'm sure there's a Portuguese story just like that, except that the natives of the Amazon have, there were approximately, they estimate about 5 million of them pre-contact, and now they're down to maybe 200,000. They don't know how many there are out in areas that they have yet to be contacted. But as you saw just now, the culture of the natives of the Amazon is very much of the spirit of Brazil, to the point where that show, I would say, if Buffalo Bill were here today, he'd be embarrassed. I mean, in North American culture, the imagery and the culture of the natives was completely exploited and transformed, and to this day it's still an issue in North America, Canada, US, Mexico. But this show, I'd say, tops the list for extravagance. And of course, I was thinking, what's the most endangered thing in Brazil? Subtlety. But anyway, I'll give you a little background about the natives. And I've had my experience. I told you that when I was a mere 20 years old, I came down the upper Amazon, got at the end of my wits trying to go somewhere, and I was living in a Jivaro people village who were very kind to me up in Ecuador, and I came down, and now that seems like another century, another eon ago compared to what's happened in the Amazon. When I first came to Manaus, it was a city of maybe 500,000. Now it's pushing 3 million people, and our friend here was saying Parintins, where we were, was so clean and nice and friendly. Well, that's before it becomes a bigger industrial town, because there's no oil here. It's a market town for the endless uplands, and they bring things down, get on the boats. Tomorrow we'll be in Santarém, which is a few times bigger than Parintins and much busier, but particularly if you go there, go to the fish market. And there's a line of these wooden Amazon boats all the way down the line, and it's a lot livelier than this town we were today. But as far as, let's say, the native culture, this area has no more indigenous people along the main river. These are all what they call the caboclo, the ribeiros, so the people that are mixed in between native, European, African stock, and so they become the mix of Brazil. And there was a French anthropologist, Louis Aganis, who came to Brazil back in the late 1800s, and his postulation in the science of anthropology at the time was that the interbreeding of all these different cultures, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, would create a new race of people who would be far more capable than any one of them. And he considered Brazil to be the place where miscegenation and intermarriage was allowed and actually encouraged, that created the great mulatto culture of Brazil, and that would be the future of humanity, is no longer racial segregation and national identity, but the combination of all these forces would create a new kind of a human, which you can see in Brazil, especially with those fantastic people with fantastic feathers. I think the feathers were only put on. They don't actually have them on their body. But anyway, we saw something today that I've not been to this town before. I've only heard about it. Now that I've been here, I still don't believe it. But anyway, it's an example of the exuberance of Brazilian culture, such as it is. But anyway, I'm going to show you a little bit about, not that. My brain doesn't really want to work here, but I'll just show you a bit about the local area. Of course, we're back in the vastness of the Amazon. We're getting near the ocean, but that's another 500 miles away. And so the Amazon basin, being as large as Europe, as large as the continental North America, and the comparisons are vast. And I worked for many years on the Yangtze River, so that this is the comparable river, except it's even bigger. And of course, it has a lot less population. It's not as industrialized. So even going up to Manaus and other ports we're going to see, I'm always surprised by, let's say, the potential there for more people or more industry, though I don't know if I want to wish it upon the place. And so you can imagine when the first humans came to this part of the world, estimated about 10,000 years ago. They keep finding earlier evidence of humanity. Currently, the earliest archaeological site in all of the Americas is at a cave in southern Chile, which dates about 12,000 years ago. So this is where the archaeological research keeps pushing back the time when humans came from, and then it also posits the question of where did they come from. Now, the standard theory is they came across the Bering Strait when it was ice, and they populated all the way down to South America, except that there are older sites in South America than there are in North America. And then they've also, through mitochondrial DNA analysis, found that there is a trace of Polynesian heritage within some of the native peoples of South America. And then maybe there was exchanges for various other places we just don't know. It's very hard to prove any of this, except that science is pursuing the question, where did people come from? But you can imagine if you were arriving on your canoe from wherever and you came up the Amazon and you were in this remarkable environment with this incredible forest and its variety, the world's greatest center of biodiversity, and then you had to figure out what to do. I mean, the Europeans, when they first came here, they didn't know what to do at all, so they depended upon the natives to show them how to harvest the fruit, how to survive the conditions here. And so then you had things like this to contend with. Now, I'm not going to talk about the wildlife of the Amazon because we have naturalists aboard who have great experience. They have a lot to say about it, except that you don't want to meet an anaconda or other critters that are around in the woods because it's something like other tropical environments. Everything's trying to eat everything else, and so I trust that all of us are here, right? Nobody got caught today by poisonous toads or jaguars. We had our guide on our boat in Manaus who, true or not, he said that a friend of his was up fishing somewhere up from the Rio Negro, and he was in the evening and a jaguar jumped on him and broke his neck and devoured him. So this is one of those few places in the world where we are not at the top of the food chain, except at the restaurant here. So you can imagine people came here and had to adapt to this environment wherever they came from. And so it's inherently a dangerous place. And so if you know about the environment, you can survive. And then you can harvest what you want, the great fish and the fruit. And so actually life is pretty easy as long as you know what to do. And you don't, for instance, go swimming in a pool of piranhas or such. And so they keep finding more evidence of early human habitation in parts of the Amazon, especially in the lower delta region where we are going right now. There are petroglyphs, there are caves, and what they found, particularly from deforestation, are the remains of human settlements. This is estimated to be a fortress palisade kind of a construction that implicated a settlement, and then they found roads, the remains of roads going far out into the forest. And the researchers estimate there were towns of, let's say, 10,000 or so people going back 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. But this is something that science is trying to pursue. Where did these people come from? And this site in Rego Grande is, again, in Amapá state on the north side of the Amazon toward the ocean. And they were clearing the forest to have a cattle range, and they found these very curious carved stones, which have then been studied, and they found that, like a Stonehenge, they can cite the winter solstice through the rock and the point there. And so this is most curious, I'd say, because the thought now is that there was a more advanced culture here how many thousand years ago, but then it was lost or evolved, or the climatic changes came, or they had warfare. But no one in the Amazon built cities like the Incas or the Aztecs, the Mayan culture in the Missouri River Valley. I mean, this is still a matter of great intrigue as the ancient past in all of the Americas. So this is a cave in Maracau which has funereal ceramics, again going back over 2,000 years. There's pottery remains that go back at that time, and they're fairly simple. This is not related to anything, let's say, in the Middle East or even the uplands of the Andes, except that they keep finding more evidence there were more and more people here. This is an area, again, in Amapá state north of here, which is Terra Preta, which was literally means the baked earth, where this was a culture that did the slash and burn, and then they had a lot of ceramics, and they left layers of ash and then broken ceramics through various parts of the forest, which was the debris of a culture as we study in other parts of the world. So what that has surmised is that there was an Amazonal peoples here going back into prehistory and spread on sites all the way up to Peru. And then there was also coastal cultures and the cultures down the Tupi-Guarani down near Rio de Janeiro and southern Brazil. But you can appreciate how vast this land was, especially in the river systems where you had to paddle or hike to get anywhere. So people developed in great isolation to the point where pre-contact there were hundreds of isolated peoples, all had developed their own languages, and so they were not unified by, let's say, the kind of conquest of the Incas or the warfare in the Central Valley of Mexico, which created the Aztec Empire, because just the nature of the geography and the riverine system meant people were very isolated. And I remember in my readings, one of the peoples in the upper Amazon, because of the difficulty to go travel and to communicate, because they all had distinct languages, they would catch a special bird that was like a mockingbird. It imitated other birds' sounds, and so the way to go travel was to catch that bird and bite its head off and gobble it up and be able to be multilingual just like the bird was. Now, don't try that with your mockingbirds at home, but this was just the nature of the vast rainforest. So we're here near Marajó and the Tarajoso. This is Santarém. There's a giant river we'll see all of tomorrow, a meeting of the waters, and this broad Amazon spreads out. And so, you know, we've already, just by being here just a few days, you can just see how vast this place is. And then before modern technology, how difficult it was to go very far. I mean, we saw 5 knots of current in the river just today, and so how are you going to get upstream? Well, that's why people were so isolated. And so when the first Europeans came, they couldn't quite believe how there were all these people living in all these places in perhaps an idyllic state of Eden. And this brings out for the Europeans, the philosophy of Rousseau and the the noble savages in isolation, free of the corruption of urbanization, industrialization, all that. And that is an idea that still comes to us, though they didn't express that in that show tonight. Well, anyway, I'll talk a little bit about just the exuberance of the native peoples. Now, we have this in North America and other parts of the world, but a lot of the Brazilian music in particular has its origins in the native cultures, whichever of the many peoples there are. These are the Tupinamba, and even the samba dancing and the rhythms and some of the musical instruments come from the native peoples, particularly the cuica and the berimbau. And so when you ever hear Brazilian music, it's somewhat distinctive because they have all these instruments and rhythms that come from the native peoples. It's not Portuguese, and part of it is particularly in the southern Bahia and other parts of Brazil, they have a lot of African influence. But when you come up to even the show tonight, it is a version of the mixture of cultures and the inheritance of a certain qualities of the native peoples. And the early Portuguese explorers came here and they were impressed by the exuberance of the natives. They sing and dance and live a very simple life, but they were always exuberantly dancing and singing. And so this is an inheritance in Brazil these days. Well, but the general story of all these peoples is that they have had a difficult time, particularly because of the contact and the infection of common diseases, the flu, the smallpox, cholera. All these things have decimated the local people, just like in the rest of the Americas, to the point where we only have remnant groups, most of who have been semi-assimilated. And so where we are in the Amazon, until you go up into the far tributaries, you do not have any pure blood or culturally intact native peoples here. And so the people you saw today, they're what is referred to in Brazil as the caboclos or the ribeiros, the river people that are mixed breed. They speak a kind of Portuguese, though it's quite different than Lisbon. And they have a mixed religion, Christianity and such, but the Brazilian government has been trying to protect the last of the people that are uncontacted and unaffected by the transformation of their society. This is Willem Busch, the anthropologist, and his brother Fernando, who particularly worked with the Xingu people who are upstream to the south from where we are. And they're, again, a larger group that was given a territory which has been under assault from agriculture and deforestation, and particularly dam building in recent years. So there is some effort by the Brazilian government to counteract the forces of history that have, let's say, diluted and diminished the native isolation and culture. But to this day, right, as this illustration shows, there's been about 40% of the Amazon basin that has been given to nature preserves and to indigenous cultures. And this is comparable perhaps best in at least in the U.S. and Canadian culture of having a reservation system and then giving legal land rights to the indigenous people. Most famously in Alaska, the Alaska Native Land Rights Act, which gave title to vast tracts of Alaska in the name of the indigenous people, to the point where they then have their own corporate and governmental structures that can then use their resources, and then they have a status to modernize or else to provide prosperity to the people. But in Brazil, even up to now, the indigenous people have always been considered legal minors, meaning they are children of the state. And to this day, the executive department of the Brazilian government grants territorial rights to the indigenous groups, of which there's about 200 in Brazil alone, but then they can also deny them or change that. And so this is the conflict of the Amazon, is that a lot of the indigenous people do not have firm legal rights to their very own land. And then they also have a lot of people, or rather groups, in the most isolated parts that they've kept out of contact because of the problem with diseases, and then illegal mining and deforestation and missionary work and such, which then changes their culture completely once they've been contacted. So here's a bit of the the Brazilian contact with some of the natives. But these days there are still groups that have been not contacted. When the satellite surveillance or the airplanes go over, they find a new clearing in the far upper Amazon. Sometimes they're greeted with bows and arrows and blowguns. So there are people that are still out there that are uncontacted, and the policy of the Brazilian government is when they find them, they prohibit any incursion into the territory, though, of course, there's this whole vast forest, and it is being chewed at, and the contact goes on. So within maybe 100 years, there will be no more people that are uncontacted, such as it is. Meanwhile, you have all these territories, not even just outside of Manaus, where there's sort of a mixed culture. Whether they're actually mixed breed is one thing, but the basic Amazon culture is producing food from the forest. Here's a woman pounding manioc. We saw this in the market today. The big tuber, which is a planted crop in the clearings, and a major staple for everybody in Brazil. A guy was selling little packets of what he called farinha, which was manioc grain that's turned into sort of like a couscous and then added with some flavor, because it has no flavor on its own. But this is sort of the potato or the rice of the whole Amazon area. And then they also have wild game. Here's a group hunting a tapir. The people would live off of the resources of the forest originally. And when I was up in the Hivero area, we would go out hunting for monkeys every day, and I still don't like the taste of monkey, no matter how well it's prepared at the grill. Well, I'll show you pictures of various people, and this is your National Geographic moment where you get to admire the body and beauty of these people. Now, a lot of them no longer do this, I have to say, the piercing and the tattooing and the painting, though I admired the costumes tonight. That was the fake tattoo all over. They were dressed in, well, I think it's just a T-shirt, so you can get one yourself if you like when you go dancing again. But there's a lot of spirit in these people. What few I know in my experiences here, these are essentially happy people, especially when they are left alone and they're not conflicted about going to Manaus and going to get a job and suddenly going to see the world in the whole, let's say, global community. These are the Yanomamo, who are up on the border with Venezuela. And like a lot of them, hey, who needs clothes when you can paint your body? And there's a lot of, let's say, this kind of celebratory culture. They have a subsistence agriculture, and then they have their children, and they have sort of a deep communality between them. There's no sense of property or differences in the classes and things like that. They will have either a matriarchal or a patriarchal structure in the family, but they're only a small group. Often only up to about 100 people will live in a longhouse, or what they call it, the maloca. And there are a lot of varieties of this. These are temporary housings they build in the forest, and they have their clearing, they grow their manioc and their fruit gathering, and they hunt around the area. And when the soil is exhausted for growing manioc, the staple, then they will move on and they'll clear another piece of land. They'll build another longhouse. This is a round one called a llano. And there's a lot of variety. Some of them live on the river in floating houses like this up the river. There used to be a lot of these in Manaus, but the government cleared them out because of the lack of sanitation on the river. But this riverine culture is very rich in that they live off the river in the forest, and as long as they want nothing more, they are fine. And I heard one of our friends in Manaus said, "Oh, well, the natives are so lazy because they don't want money, and they don't feel the need for this." But as soon as you enter into a money culture and education and technology, it's very hard to go back to the subsistence. But the skills of these people is often remarkable. How they can hunt, fish, gather. So there's an ancient wisdom here that is being steadily lost depending on where you are in the Amazon. But let's say the purebred and uncontacted people are fewer and fewer, though every year they keep finding more and farther away places. Often they are refugees from conflicts from the rubber trade or impact with other peoples, and they go up into the woods and go into isolation. So here's a kid with putting curare on the blow dart. Did anybody buy a blowgun today? I'll tell security if you did, but they're made now as trinkets for the tourist trade. But you can. I bought a bow and arrow today just to try on my local groundhogs in my garden. But this is the culture of a people who live off of hunting and gathering and nomadic. So it's let's say it's a prehistoric look back into the way all of our ancestors once were. Though I come from Neanderthals and we knew better. No, anyway. So, and this is actually Jivaro Head up in the up waters of the Amazon in Ecuador, and they were famous for fighting with their neighbors and then giving a little homage to their enemies by devouring the bodies and shrinking the heads. Though my head has stayed pre-shrunk. What can I say? Well, anyway, there's a lot of different people, and so if you're interested, there's a lot of academic research and then popular culture that comes out of it. So these feather headdresses are one of the features of the Amazon because there are all these fantastic birds. And of course, when you look at this, say, how many birds did it take to make this kind of decorations? Much less tonight. So I went up to the chieftain of all chieftains, and I said, "Where'd you get these feathers?" And he said, "Pheasants, imported from England." No, but those are by far the biggest feathers I've ever seen, and I've seen a few. And then there's the kind of tattooing and facial painting. Now you can get this up in the spa, but you'll have to show them the pictures, what you want. And so there's a lot of different peoples here. A lot of them, again, these are often photos that I found places. And these people are now suddenly in T-shirts and blue jeans and working in the market in Manaus. So a lot of it is now lost, but then there are always a few more. And in some ways, Brazil has encouraged the appreciation of the natives. They no longer consider them savages and slaves as they were to the imposition of the culture of Brazil, but they're given more rights and more appreciation. And I always remember a group from the Xingu in their feathers and loincloths went to London to confront the officials at the World Bank to stop the Belo Horizonte Dam, saying you're going to flood our traditional lands, and we demand that we have a meeting with the directors of the World Bank and stop this project. And they were told, come back next week. And there they were, stranded in London. Well, the struggle goes on, but then as you go into the deep parts of the Amazon, you'll find villages. Some people went to the native village out of Manaus. Anybody go to that and see the remnants around Manaus, which is, of course, such a big urban center that what you see there is not what you'll find in hundreds of miles into the jungle, with things like this, a wrestling match and ceremonial warfare. But above all, the knowledge of the forest led to a whole different cosmology, spiritualism, and shamanic practices, which is true in many peoples around the world. But in the Amazon, they had this incredible pharmacology that is the knowledge of the elder shamans, including women. But here they are in a forest with the world's greatest biodiversity of plant life, and then they, through thousands of years of trying things, they found analgesics. Let's say quinine, for instance, to counter malaria, is an Amazon plant that was then turned to pharmacology, and many, many other things that are in the pharmacological wealth of the world come from the Amazon. But if you go into the forest with one of the native peoples, they will have an encyclopedia in their head of what's good for this, that, and the other. Someone was telling us there's an oil they put on the skin that prevents mosquito bites, and it's non-toxic, so they don't use the DEET or any Western-style medicines because that's poisonous, but they have something for almost everything. And so this tremendous forest is a wealth of plant products, such as they are, and this is the study of these people going back so far. So this fellow has a glass jar full of what's called yagé, cayapi, or ayahuasca, depending on where you are in the upper Amazon. And this is considered a spiritual act to take a pulverized vine mixed with other ingredients of the forest, and then it's taken in a ceremony, which then creates, first of all, a toxic reaction where you heave and you're in convulsions, and then you have a spiritual message from the ancestors and the animal spirits, and then you have visions. And so this is a very common phenomena of many of the peoples particularly in the upper Amazon. I don't think it's around here because it's been lost, or else the plants are not the same. But here's a shaman taking his ayahuasca. Here's one having a vision to try to heal a young child. And so this has actually become well known in the outside world. It was first studied by Richard Schultes, who was a botanist who came here in the 1920s. Then Allen Ginsberg and other characters came down and had the ceremonies and took it. I myself did it back in the 1970s in the upper regions in Peru. And it's not recreational. It's actually a kind of a painful experience. And then you have visions such that you contact the outer spirits, such as it is. Now, these are contemporary paintings of some of the ayahuasca practitioners, which, by the way, is a legal substance. You can get it in Europe and in North America now because it's not considered a narcotic or even a recreational, such as it is like a cocaine, but it's more like the peyote that you get in the American Southwest. It's allowed for the natives, and they have people coming from the Amazon having ayahuasca ceremonies in Europe and North America now. And this is all about communicating with the greater spirits, in this case the jaguar spirit. And this is the Sequoia people's imagery that is made from their sort of visions, and it's sort of a proto-visual language. And they weave this into very delicate textiles, which they give to people. And it's an example of a sort of a psychotropic visionary experience. Now, you cannot get this at the Sky Bar, but people come here just for this experience, I should say. And here's I'm going to show you a couple of contemporary views of it. This is actually a photo collage. You can see the palm trees on the lower left and right side, but this is the spirit of the forest that comes out and impresses upon your soul as you're here. And then there's more, let's say, obvious graphic representations of the river spirit and the forest. So this is becomes sort of like I'd say a good acid trip. And so people come just to do this in the Amazon. And this is actually paintings by an American artist named Alex Gray, who is a practitioner of hallucinogenic visuals, and he had been originally a medical anatomical illustrator, and then he had these experiences, and then he produced things like this. Now, again, you don't want to do this before dinner, but this is something that came out of the Amazon that is, just a kind of a impression of the inner world of these native people. So this shaman got all dressed up to have a meeting with a Brazilian government official because the road builders came and cut a road across this is Xingu people, by the way, across, and they, with their wooden clubs, went and attacked the bulldozers. And they had to bring in the military, stop the fighting. And, this is completely different worlds colliding. So you have a shaman with his hallucinations meeting an engineer with his bulldozer, and there's just no way to solve this except by mediation from government officials. And so this is the real problem in the Amazon, is that these native peoples who have retreated into the forest, and then now they are being recontacted by road building and agriculture and the trouble I told you about. So even in an area like this in Rondônia that is a indigenous area, the ranchers have come in, the miners have come in, and they end up being contacted even by riverboats that now with motors could get up every stream, and then they start building roads, and development comes in, and so these people that want isolation and don't understand the outside world are suddenly in complete contact. And then this is the Trans-Amazon Highway, which stretches from Belém all the way to Peru and then up over the mountains. And this is spreading development, such as it is, all through the Amazon. So the few people that are still isolated are no longer. I mean, there are, every year they keep finding a few remnants, but the development of the Amazon means these people are essentially doomed to become modern, such as it is. So this is a woman and her child that became sort of lost people as the road came across. The miners and ranchers come in, and there have been examples of them coming in and burning down the villages and chasing away the people. And then if they want to survive, they end up having to work for the incursion. So this is the tragedy of the Amazon, where these people would have been fine if they're left alone, but that's no longer possible. But there are still some, and they still are trying to adjust. And in a way, they also influence the rest of Brazil as a kind of idyllic state that is no longer possible. But the Brazilian government has been grappling with this problem for now a couple of hundred years. But one thing they do is they try to go out and they inoculate people who are not in contact, so the children will not succumb to common diseases that most children don't get in the place where there's vaccines and medical care. And so now you have even pure blood natives that are in contact, but they try to leave them alone and give them a rudimentary education. But again, there's no going back to the era of complete isolation. Then the other point of the Brazilian government's policy, there's an institute called IPUA, which is for the indigenous people's sustenance. So they try to encourage sustainable agriculture in the forest. So here's cacao to make chocolate, gathering Brazil nuts, guaraná, acai, and other products of the Amazon that are freely available, rubber tapping, the wild rubber and such, so that they've made a lot of small-scale cooperatives and then provide subsidies to ship the products to the markets and develop something that is sustainable so people do not have to move to Manaus to have a job. This is all actually cacao beans for making chocolate. So again, the gift of the Amazon to the world is chocolate, tobacco, thank you very much, chili peppers, manioc, and things that we can't imagine not having anymore. So here's indigenous people with their own brand of chocolate that they now export, the Kalari. And so hopefully, people can survive in their villages and not have to move, and can survive and then send things to market and continue to live where they are. But they also have a problem where there's a lot of poaching of wildlife, birds, and here in this case, one of the caiman, and that goes to markets in Belém and Manaus. And so part of the problem of the government of Brazil is to try to prevent the illegal trade in forest products, not just lumber, but the wildlife. Because if you're living up some far tributary, if you get a jaguar skin like there on the lower right, I mean, that'll give you money to buy a new phone, even if you don't get service. But this is where the world is changing, and it's very hard for these people to adapt and live on very little or something. And of course, where we are now, again, you're with the mixed caboclo. You don't have the native peoples where we are going on our exit of the Amazon Valley. But further up, there are villages and there are people that are still there with variation on their adaptability. And this is actually, I pulled this out of a recent National Geographic magazine of modern Amazonia, where the young people are sort of proud that they're native, but they're also wearing cargo pants. They got their phones, they have their tarps, they probably are listening to some samba music from the south. And in this case, they're all dressed up for some party, which maybe not what their tradition was, but there's a lot of pride among the native peoples, even if they're in transition, which is true in North America also. You have how many groups that are sort of a mixed culture, if that's the right way to say it. This guy has a Batman mask on, so that shows you where the cultural power is. And let me go. I'm going backwards here, but what we've seen right now in our just a couple of days here is the commercialization of this native culture. So all the trinkets and the dreams of the Indian maiden and the big-eyed child, all this. I mean, this was just the other day in Manaus, and so not unlike going out to the Indian powwows of the Southwest or wherever, that it becomes a commercial activity, and then far villages will actually make a little bit of a living making masks like this out of piranha. Didn't anybody get their piranha mask yesterday? Or their blowguns and rattles? I mean, what are you going to take home if you don't get this, right? And especially, this is a fantastic mask, which I bought one of like this the previous year, and I took it home, and I'm still scared to look at it. But above all, if you want to have a souvenir of the native culture here, the hammock was invented in the Amazon, and if you ever live in a climate which is warm enough, I recommend getting one of them. You get them in, this is out the street of Santarém. It was 100 reais, this one, which is about $30, but beautifully woven. And this is, again, something of the native people's gift to the rest of the world. But you can imagine the young people growing up in the backwoods of the Amazon, wondering what's next and what they have to do to make a living, and how the world has changed, and maybe they can't even speak the same language as their elders, and then they go away, they get some education. So this kid has his tattoo painting that he went through puberty, and now he's on a boat wondering where to go. Maybe he was there in the show tonight, I don't know, but I'll just sort of end my talk about what is the future of these peoples and of Amazonia, as they call the whole area. Well, I'm not the specialist in this, but all I can say is if they do not protect the forest and they do not protect the waters, then it's all doomed, because the problem with Amazonia in general is the continued deforestation, agriculture, mining, the commerce we saw in Manaus. But what that is creating is either polluted water, denuded land. Whole tracts to the south of the Amazon are becoming a desert because they grow soybeans and then the soil bakes and it's no good. And so the incursion of the global economy, such as it is a real challenge for these people. And so we hope that the spirit of Brazil, the Alma Brasileira, is sort of in the native peoples and then shared with the rest of us, and especially in the music. So at this point, I'm going to show you a couple of Amazon indigenous instruments, and I hope you'll all sing along. Now, the first one, I got this just the other day. It's a genuine native flute with piracucu shells and guaraná beads on it, and that'll call the birds out of the woods here. So Mimi, you're on. And then all these things that are in Brazilian music, if you hear the samba bands and they're part of the national music, but this is sort of the national instrument, which is the berimbau, which is a very simple string with a resonator, and it's often played with a voice in the resonator so that it now, whereas African music in Brazil elsewhere has a 1-2 beat, the backbeat of rock and roll. In Brazilian music, you have a double one and then a second beat. That's your cue. Come on up, Mimi. You can all get them dance if you like, but well, we're going to work on it, and you'll see you at the next show. Thank you very much, and enjoy the Amazon. Thank you.